Well, my mother's parents, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, moved to Foley from Rutledge, Alabama. And when they got to Baldwin County, back that time, land was affordable. My grandfather bought 40 acres here on the corner of 24 and 59, and he bought 80 acres about a mile and a half north of here, west of here on Daughtry Road, and that was known as the Big Farm, and this was the home farm. But they moved down here from Rutledge around 1913 and started farming. He raised potatoes, corn. He never had any cattle. My father followed on with the cattle, but my grandfather at some point decided he needed a little extra income, so he built a little brick building at the corner of Highway 59 and County Road 24. It was built around 1929 because I remember my mom saying they opened a general store at the worst possible time, right at the beginning of the Depression. But my grandmother and my mom ran the general store, and my dad during World War II worked in the shipyards in Mobile. And my grandmother had a big 2-story house over on the corner very near the general store. And Mom and Grandma ran the general store, and they sold everything. They sold gas, cloth. I can remember seeing hams hanging from the ceiling, cured hams. But when my grandmother died, my mom was busy, and so they closed up that little general store, and they rented it to the Alabama Department of Agriculture, and they were going to eradicate fire ants. You know, fire ants came into the United States on a ship in Mobile and spread to Baldwin County. So they were going to try to eradicate all the fire ants in Baldwin County, and they had some poison that they put out with big hoppers and spreaders on the back of Jeeps, and they'd go all over the county. But anybody saw fire ants, they'd call, and they'd go out there and put this pesticide out. For years, that building smelled like that. I think it was called diazinon, I'm not sure, but it had a unique odor. For years, that building smelled like that. Then, when they quit doing that, a guy moved in, had a television shop there. Great big old bulky black and white outside antenna TVs. Following that, it became a pawn shop, and now it's a barber shop. But that little building's been here since, well, before 1929, because they opened the store up in 29. But like everything else back in those days, they knew a brick mason, and they knew a carpenter, and they knew a guy that did roofing, and they would call or go by and see and get them to come out and do it and pay them. Anybody that wanted to build a building back then, I think, acted as their own general contractor. I don't believe there were many people back then that you could go to and say, build me a building, and my grandfather, my father's father, built the old Gift Horse restaurant in downtown Foley. There's a plaque on the front built by Matthew Sute. There were just a very few pecan trees that my maternal grandfather planted. He died, I'm not sure exactly, I can't remember exactly when he died, but when he died, he left my grandmother and my mother and my father all this property. And there weren't very many pecan trees out in the pasture at that time. And my dad planted quite a few pecan trees, a variety called a Stewart. And then after I retired, I went out in the orchard and doubled up with a different variety. Went down into Florida and got a different variety of pecan trees and planted them out there. We lost it all in Hurricane Sally. I lost 500 trees in this orchard and one that I had down on County Road 16. So put me out of the pecan business. Oh, my grandmother, she was a Jones, and her father was Jarrett James Jones, who was a Civil War veteran. And he was apparently, I never knew him, but he was apparently widely known for having 2 thumbs on his right hand, and what I've heard is he could pinch the heck out of you with those 2 thumbs, but I never knew him. The family had 7 boys and 2 girls, and my grandfather, Sute is not our original name. We don't know what the original name was, but my grandfather got an identification card at the Pullman Car Company. And that's when the name Sute began. It never was in any records before that. But he packed his family up and moved from Chicago to Foley by railroad. And I've been told that they had leased a boxcar, and it had 2 families and 2 mules in the boxcar from Chicago to Foley. And then there was a second boxcar that came down with household goods later. But my dad was from a big family, and he grew up here in Foley. He was a child when he moved here, but he grew up in Foley. He was a carpenter and built a lot of houses here in Foley. And he built this little house that we're in now. And he was a big, tall guy. He loved to hunt quail. He loved to fish. He would take me down to Magnolia Springs, and back in those days, nobody owned their own boat. There was an old wooden skiff down there, or several of them, and people would just go and use it. And he would take me down there and strap a little 3-horse motor on the back of it, and we'd get in that skiff, and it'd be cold, and it'd be about 1 inch or 2 of water in the bottom. My feet would get cold, and I'd almost cry. I'd be so miserable. But he'd get me down there the next Saturday morning and Friday morning, whatever. We'd go down to Magnolia Springs and go speckled trout fishing. He was a real outdoorsman. He ran cattle and he row cropped. In addition, I think back then everybody had at least two jobs. But he was a good guy. I like my dad. A really good guy. When my mom and dad got married, I don't know where they lived before they built this house, but my dad, my uncles, and my paternal grandfather built this little house. It was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath house, and they added on to it several times, and I've got a lot of memories growing up in this old house here. My mother lived here by herself for a number of years until things just got too rough, and then she moved into town. But it was a different time back then. We had a neighbor who called him Uncle Al, and Uncle Al, he was a German. He enjoyed beer, and my dad used to go to bingo at the Catholic Church on Wednesday night, and my mom would go to bed, and I was here at the time, but I was a little kid. And one night my mom was in bed and Dad had gone to bingo, and she heard him come home, and she heard him get in his chair, and he never came to bed. She went up there to see what was going on, and it wasn't my dad, it was Uncle Al. He'd just come to the wrong house and walked in and went to sleep. The door was open and unlocked. It was a different time back then, different time. Well, let me tell you about my school. I went to the first and second grade in Foley. And then our local priest talked to my dad and my mom, and they transferred me to St. Benedict's in Alberta. And it was very small classes, so I went the 3rd through the 8th grade in St. Benedict's. And when I graduated elementary school, I moved to Foley High School and graduated from Foley High. And my high school class, we have a class reunion lunch every other month. This past lunch, I think we had 12 classmates there. But we were a real close group, and I played football in Foley in 1961 and 1962 seasons. Was undefeated, 10-0 and 10-0. In 61 season, we scored over 300 points in 10 games, and our opponents scored 6. Next season was, everybody else was better than they were, but we still went undefeated. And Coach Ivan Jones was our coach, and he's a great guy. He came into the dressing room. We didn't have all the organizations that, you know, that help kids now. We didn't have that, but all the merchants and the family, parents of the kids, got together and got money and sent us to the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans on a train, on a Hummingbird out of Mobile. And we all dressed up in coat and ties and went to see the Sugar Bowl. And I remember Coach Ivan Jones coming into the dressing room before we left, and he had a letter from the mayor of Robertsdale giving us permission to run the red light on the way home. We grew up in a wonderful place and a wonderful time. I had a great childhood here. Let me tell you about the swimming holes. When I was growing up, very few houses were air conditioned. None of the cars were air conditioned. And it's pretty hot down here in the summer. And so we would go, they had 2 swimming holes. One of them was Sandy Creek, which was out by Barron Field. And the other one was the Ice Box, which is down near Bon Secours. And my best friend was Joe Mannering. His father ran the warehouse, ran a Western Auto store in Foley. And we'd either get my mother or Joe's mother to take us to Sandy Creek, and we'd go swimming. There'd be 12, 15 people down there swimming in that nice little swimming hole. Or when I got older and could drive a little bit, we'd go down to Bon Secours to the Ice Box, which is on Bon Secours River. And had a big long rope that went up to the top. I don't know how they got it up to the top of that pine tree, but somebody had gone up there and tied a rope, and it must have been 60 feet long. And we'd swing off the bank and do flips into the ice box down there. And it was especially fun after football practice in August. Couldn't have lived without being able to go to the ice box after practice and cool down. It's just simple things. We didn't have anything sophisticated. It was all pretty simple, but we were as happy as we could be. Back in my day, it's interesting the way agriculture was. Baldwin County shipped out satsumas. Baldwin County shipped out gladiolus. Gladiolus are a lily called funeral lilies. And there were several people, the Claprood Farms and Kraft Farms down at Gulf Shores, they grew gladiolus. Well, you had to cut them real early in the morning before daylight, because when the sun hit them, they'd start to open up. So they would hire people go out in the field and cut gladiolus and bring them to Foley or Loxley or Robertsdale, ice them down in these big waxed cardboard boxes and put them on a railroad car, boxcar, and ship them to Chicago. And it was interesting because if the train left Foley at 10:30, if you didn't get to Foley and get your gladiolus on the train by 10:30, there wasn't no problem. You could always beat the train to Bay Minette and go up there and put them on in Bay Minette. And when I was growing up, the big crop in Baldwin County was Irish potatoes. And we got out of school early to work on the potato sheds. And we had migrant workers that came in every year for the potato harvest, and they would drive these big, beautiful, fancy, big old heavy-duty agricultural farm trucks and park them there near the park, and then all the potato sheds were along the railroad track there. And I used to be amazed at those big, beautiful trucks. They were just something. But Foley was booming when it was potato season. I mean, the streets were full and people walking in and out of shops downtown. It was quite the deal. And at one time, he even raised a crop called tongue nuts. Every farmer had a little wet spot in their farm, and the tongue nut trees are invasive and they love wet soil. So these tongue nut trees will grow up and they go out in the early summer and knock the nuts off the trees when they still had a lot of sap in them, throw them in the back of a pickup truck and drive to Pensacola. And there was a buyer in Pensacola that had a machine that tilted the truck up and let the tongue nuts run out of the back into a hopper, and then they would crush them for the oil. You can still buy tongue oil in paint shops. It's a wood preservative. But that was one of the little crops that they had around here. Grew cucumbers. You go to the Foley Farmers Market on Saturday morning, you'll still see some of the little truck farmers selling their cucumbers and onions and radishes and lettuce and things like that. It was a different time back then. Didn't have any cotton. Had a lot of cattle. Baldwin County was full of cattle. Even had milk cows. We had Woodhaven Dairy, and I think Barber Dairy may have had a creamery here, but just a different agricultural day. You could always get a job working on a farm, always. You may not like it, may not pay much, but you could always get a job working on the farm. Let me tell you about downtown Foley. When I was at dinner one night with my mom and dad, and there was a guy named Max Lorenz who owned the hardware store there in Foley. And I had a little model airplane motor that I was fiddling with, and Mr. Max came over to look at it, and he was entranced by that little motor. I guess I was about 14 years old, and he asked me if I wanted a job, and I said, yeah. So So I went to work for Mr. Max. I was 14 or 15 years old. My mom she'd take me to work and come pick me up. And I worked in the Foley hardware. And I learned more about the world in Foley hardware than I did at any other time in my life. We sold oyster tongue teeth. We sold red lead, which the shrimpers would mix with tongue oil to paint the bottom of their shrimp boats, because the red lead would kill anything. And it's a wonder it didn't kill me, because you couldn't walk near that sack of red lead without it just would coat you all over the place. And it came, I guess, in 500-pound sacks, because they had to get a forklift to get it off the truck and get it in the hardware store. And we sold mouse traps, rat traps, and we kept a broom, and the mouse traps came in a big cardboard box. And we kept a broom there by the box, because a lot of people would come in milling around in the hardware store, and they'd think it was cute to set one of the traps and put it back in the box. So every time we went to get a mouse trap out of the box, we'd take that broom and stir it around in the box to make sure there wasn't any set traps in there. And I don't know, I still remember the guys, Hank Top, Willie Porter, Charles Tate, Mr. Max Lorenz, Grace Lorenz. They all part of me, part of growing up. And Mr. Max owned the Foley Tractor Company with the John Deere dealer back then. It was right downtown. And I'd have to go over there every now and then on an errand. And I remember being amazed at those great big old pistons. They were the size of a gallon bucket. The old John Deere 2-cylinder tractors. And a guy named Johnny Schaff ran the John Deere dealership, and Mr. Max eventually sold it to Mr. Schaff. And Johnny bought the 8 acres from this piece of property that we're on now to build the John Deere dealership. Let me tell you about the roads in Baldwin County back when I was growing up. Highway 59 was a 2-lane highway. And downtown Foley, it didn't have angle parking or parallel parking or anything. It was all straight in, and you had to back out into traffic. It didn't matter, because there wasn't hardly any traffic. And what traffic there was sedate pace. That's the best I can say about it. And back then, people would buy a car or a pickup and drive it until it just collapsed. It wasn't. There was a guy named Mr. Rutledge who worked at the Ford dealership, and about every 5 years, he would pull up in our driveway with a new station wagon from my mom. And he would say, "Von Seal, I just want you to drive this a couple of days and let me know what you think about it." And he'd take our old car and leave the new car here. And without fail, my dad would pay for the new car and buy Mom a new vehicle. It was always a station wagon. And we would take those station wagons, 6-cylinder, column shift, and go on vacation. My grandmother, my mom, and a friend of my mom's and I would get in that old station wagon and drive to Key West in the summertime. Wow. I'd sleep in the back on top of all the luggage, and we'd take a dog with us. We always had a dog here. But the traffic was way, way, way different back then. A lot more sedate and not much of it. let me tell you about my dad. He was a carpenter. He and a couple of my uncles and my grandfather built this house. But he did a lot of work for the large farmers, the bigger guys that had big barns and big sheds and big facilities. And well, after World War II, he worked in the shipyard. After World War II, he and my uncle Lawrence rode the train to Detroit, and they bought 2 identical flatbed Ford trucks. They were green with cream colored accent on them, and they had the old, what you call, granny transmission, and it had a low gear and then a double low. And a double low, it was a walking pace. And he would let me get in one of them, his truck, out here in the pasture, or we owned an 80-acre farm where the outlet mall is now on Highway 59 south of Foley. And that's where I learned to drive. He just cranked the truck up and I'd get behind the wheel and steer it. I couldn't reach any of the pedals. If I saw trouble coming up, I'd just turn it off. And he would come down and crank it up and turn the wheel and get me out of trouble. But I learned to drive in that old flatbed Ford truck until this is my grandfather and his Crosley station wagon. I inherited that Crosley station wagon when I was about 13 years old, and I had a friend named Bobby Sneeflock, whose father managed what we call the bird farm, which was a large wooded tract owned by the Foley family. And Bobby had a Cushman motorcycle, and we had these little fire roads through the bird farm. And Bobby and I would race. He had his Cushman, and I would drive that little Crosley station wagon. We'd race each other. And I turned a corner one day, and the car just barely fell over on its side. Well, we went and got help, and we tilted it back up. But little did I know that all the oil had spilled out of the engine. So by the time I got back home here, it was red hot, and the engine just froze up. And it was a Crosley. You couldn't buy parts for them, nor I think it just got junked. But I tore that car up, and whoa, I wish I had that one back now. Okay, let me show you a couple pictures. Here's my grandfather Moore, my mother's father, and he's holding a pair of Irish potatoes in his hand. And his picture is a part of the sign that I had painted on the south side of the little building at the corner of Highway 24 and 59. And he's in an ad for Agrico fertilizer. And the ad says, it's my grandfather, it says, Agrico meant $138.66 extra cash in my pocket one year. So I always thought that was pretty neat that my grandfather was in this advertisement. So I hired a couple of friends of mine, 2 ladies from Fish River, and they painted that sign over there. And I had to get all kinds of permission from the Department of Agriculture. Let me show you a couple of pictures of my mother. Here's my mother. Her maiden name was Noni Von Seal Moore. And she's standing in front of the little general store. And if you'll notice, there's a gas pump behind her. And it's got a glass tank on the top of it. And it had a lever to pump gas. And if you wanted 5 gallons of gas, you'd pump, and the tank was graduated. It would tell you when you got up to 5 gallons. And then you'd put the hose in the car and pull the trigger, and that 5 gallon would run into the car. It looks like a Coca-Cola sign behind her, but anyhow, she worked at the little store, and then here's a picture of my mom and dad on a date somewhere. They got some sort of fancy schmancy coupe behind them. My mom always was a Mayday queen in Daphne one year, and she always told me that your dad would never ask me out for a date until I became Mayday queen. I got tons and tons of pictures, old pictures. This is my grandfather, my grandmother on my mother's side. Here's my grandmother and my mother behind the counter in the general store in 1932.